Welcome to today's episode of the President's Diary podcast, where we explore global affairs and how leaders can respond to the opportunities and challenges that are shaping the future. I am your host, Destiny Afu, and today we are turning our attention to the Central African Republic, specifically the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and the M23 rebels. The recent peace deals signed between the DRC and Rwanda with the M23 at the heart of negotiations have been hailed as a step towards detente in one of Africa's most volatile regions. But the key question is, are we witnessing the start of a lasting peace or just another fragile pause in the cycle of conflict? To unpack this complex issue, I am joined by Jervin Naidu, joining in from South Africa. Jervin is a political analyst at Oxford Economics Africa, specializing in the field of international political economy, with particular coverage in the DRC, Ghana, Nigeria, and other East African nations. Welcome to the program, Jervin.
Hi, thanks, Destiny, for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting to you about the problems in the Great Lakes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's start with some context. The DRC and Rwanda have had a very complicated history, often marked by mistrust, cross-border tensions, and rebel activity. Could you help our audience understand the historical roots of this conflict and how the M23 particularly fits into the story?
Yeah, sure, Destiny. So it's a really complex one. I'm glad we're having a longer chat. I've done several media chats where, mainstream media sort of want you to give the answer in one go, but it's super complicated, as you mentioned. The key roots of the current conflict that's been ongoing between the DRC M23 who are backed allegedly by Rwanda. Rwanda does deny these allegations despite several international reports saying otherwise. Rwandan weapons have been found on M23, very advanced weapons, so that doesn't really hold much. But one of the key roots stems from initially from the independence of the Congo. So you had a lot of issues from the independence, but if we move ourselves forward, I would say the main issue probably bringing in M23 is probably the Rwandan genocide with the Hutus and the Tutsis that has a lot of stemming behind it. So, for example, M23 are a ethnically Tutsi-based organization who are concerned with the protection of Tutsi interests across the Congo. So they're very concerned about Tutsi interests around the Congo. Obviously, the horrible atrocities that were perpetrated during the genocide. So they are there to protect Tutsi interests, regardless of them being Rwandan, Congolese, Burundian, Ugandan, because again, the ethnicity of the Tutsi go across the Great Lakes, so it's not just one nationality. And then topping that, on top of the genocide, Destiny, we also had the two Congo wars. So essentially the first Congo war that got rid of Mobutu Sese, the longtime dictator, from the DRC's independence. He was essentially removed by Laurent Kabila was backed by Rwandan forces. That was the first Congo War. Then we had the second Congo War, which has happened almost immediately after, because once Kabila was in power, lots of Congolese were a bit uneasy at the fact that it was a foreign power. Even at that time, the army general was a Rwandan, which then triggered the second Congo War. And then you've always had these lasting tensions. So it's really deep-seated. You can even trace it back to probably a big part of the problem in most of Africa. Okay, I wouldn't say it's the most of, it's probably most of Africa, but I would say 50-50 as myself as an analyst is the colonial route. So you also have the issues with, the DRC getting its independence from the Belgians that caused a lot of problems. So it's really super complex, but in a nutshell, the M23 are an ethnically Tutsi organization looking at protecting Tutsi interests across the Congo and the Great Lakes, because they feel that their people are marginalized, they are not looked after, they are not cared. The Eastern DRC is super wealthy and their communities are not benefiting from the wealth, and it's just the sort of elites in the Congo that are benefiting from it. So in a nutshell, if I could simplify it, I know it's an oversimplification, but that's the sort of gist of it.
Okay. There was a peace deal that was, signed between the negotiations I think that was actually initiated by President Trump. And it actually involved Rwanda and the DRC and the M23 rebels. I want us to do a little analysis of this peace deal compared to previous agreements. What's the difference about this current peace deal, and why should we believe it has a chance to succeed when we know quite a lot has been failing?
Yeah, so I want to kind of give, I always, even though the work that we do as political analysts, we try and be realist, and we often see some of the worst things that human society and the poor parts of our continent are suffering. I like to be positive and say, Destiny, this is going to be a good solution, but reading into it and seeing the history of failed agreements, it tempers our expectation. This is very much so an economic deal where economic interests come first and then political demands or requirements come second. So basically, as you mentioned, the US broker deal focuses on improving tensions between Rwanda and the DRC. So the US have sort of come in and said, look, we will, assist with investment in the mining sector, because obviously on the US side, this is not just them coming in and being, oh, sort of kumbaya, I'm here to help and save, help, as they, I sometimes I don't like the discourse in Western media, but it's like, come to help these Africans, they're so struggling, they need help. But it's not that. They have strategic interests. They're particularly interested in the rare earth metals that are in the DRC, coltan and cobalt, because within the fourth industrial revolution, the US is fighting against China for access to these minerals. So they want preferential access to minerals, whereas the Chinese already have access to it with their relationship with presence and security of the DRC. So the US is angling to say, look, we'll help with some kind of security guarantee, we'll help negotiate, but in return, you give us some economic return. One of the sticking points of the negotiation, so there should have been a formal agreement. I think by August the 18th was the deadline. Yeah, August the 18th was the deadline, if I'm not mistaken, or 16th. They were supposed to have an agreement in place, to like a roadmap on how we're going to get there. But the sticking points are, so for example, the DRC want M23 to give up all their territory. So they're telling the Rwandans, we know you're working with M23. They have to give up the eastern DRC, particularly the north and south Kivu, because those towns, Goma and Bukavu, are completely controlled by M23 and Rwandan forces to a certain extent. Then the Rwandans, their main gripe, as I mentioned earlier, is they are still concerned about the FDLR. That's the Hutu armed group who fled the genocide. So, according to President Paul Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, they are still concerned that those people exist. Those people do exist in the Eastern DRC. They have sort of merged into the army and parts of that. They are still concerned about it. But just to sort of caveat this, for example, Destiny. So me and the two of us, we're young. So when we were growing up, the genocide was probably right? I was born, for example, in 1990. But for example, if a soldier was the age of 30 when the genocide happened in 1994, that soldier is now 65, if they're still alive, right? Because it's war. 65 in their late 70s. So what real actual force or what impact can these guys have? So Kagame keeps pushing this. They want to get rid of the FDLR. They want to but realistically, these guys are old. And what are you going to do? Maybe just arrest them, prosecute them. Maybe that's what he wants to do. So that's their one main concern. And there's also a lot of other technical stuff. They want the deal needs to, M23 has to give up some territory. Rwandan forces have to come back. So it's really, really complex on the politics side. So let's try and give it a positive spin for the people of Goma and Bukavu. Also, those who are fleeing into Burundi. Burundi's had a massive influx of refugees. Also, a little bit in Western Uganda. Sorry, pardon me. The PC will give some pause. Hopefully, it can blossom into something bigger. But I would like to temper expectations, given it's not really addressing the root causes. And there's these long. I was actually writing a very interesting piece. We can talk about it today about Joseph Kabila. There's just this long-standing distrust between the Congolese and the Rwandans. Particularly that genocide and the two Congo wars really has put up tensions against two countries which should be rivals in a good sense. When I think of Kenya and Tanzania, the two brothers in East Africa, they sort of use their rivalry to sort of try and elevate each other. Whereas the rivalry between the DRC and Rwanda is a bit more toxic. So sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there, but that's the gist of the deal, Destiny.
Amazing. Do we have an idea of what the main commitments of the DRC, Rwanda, and the M23 are supposed to be? I mean, like following the deal, do we have knowledge of the commitments?
Yeah, we do have. There were some that were leaked. So this is leaked in the public space. Reuters were the first to get a hold of it. So we can break it down. So some of the demands, particularly or conditions that DRC want, is they want M23 to give up control, as I mentioned, of the Eastern DRC. They want them to hand over troops that were involved in any kinds of war crimes. Because I'm sure you would have seen, particularly across media, there are reports that M23 have been allegedly complicit in war crimes in the Eastern DRC and all kinds of nasty business. So that's the main issue they have. And they also want M23 to give up the mine of Rubaya. Rubaya is one of the largest coltan mines in the world. It's, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Eastern DRC's biggest one. So they want to give up that because obviously the central government in the DRC is losing revenue because they don't control these mines. All right. So from that side, M23, they want clear promises from the DRC government that ethnic Tutsi interests will be incorporated into the broader Congolese interest. Like they don't want their communities to be sidelined anymore. They want their soldiers to be integrated into the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's the DRC's army. Those are some of the baselines. As for Rwanda, their main concerns are they want the Congolese to give up any remnants of the FDLR. They want some easing on border tensions because they believe, some of the Rwandans are running, the DRC are running operations into Rwanda to fight and all kinds of things. So that's their main concern. They're more concerned on those light issues. And there's also some concerns on the DRC. It's not mentioned directly, but the DRC, and so I know we're not talking about it, but the DRC and Uganda also have a very weird relationship because the Ugandans help the DRC, but there is some mention of dealing with another armed group in the Eastern DRC called the Allied Democratic Forces. It's a Ugandan terror group. So there's also some talks about that, but that's the gist of the agreement. Once we get the actual document, I'll be able to, I can come back on and we can unpack it further, but that's sort of the gist of some of the demands.
We know this conflict is not just about the DRC or Rwanda. There are other regional and international players involved. I could cite the African Union, the East African Community, SADC, the United Nations, and even global powers like the United States and China. How critical are these external actors to sustaining this peace process?
Yeah, they're very important. I think we don't. I know for the layman, or people who generally think the UN, for example, or the African Union is a world government. It's not. We live in what is called a realist world where each state can do its own thing, but there is a sort of liberal international order in which you can have some kind of enforcement. So the importance, particularly of the AU, and the AU has had a big failing, particularly in Africa, generally to deal with conflicts. I think the AU has only successfully intervened in, if I'm not mistaken, the Comoros, small little island. I think a couple of years ago they sent forces in there, but they haven't really been able to deal with conflict on the continent. So it's very important for them to encourage the DRC and Rwanda and M23 to keep talking and going through this process. But as you mentioned, Destiny, it's quite funny, the African Union, SADC, and the East African community couldn't get President Kagame and Tshisekedi even in the same room, but the Qataris were able to get them in the same room. That's also quite telling. This is why also President Larissau of Angola walked away from his negotiations, the Luanda process, because he was fed up. He just couldn't get them in the same room. So that then tells us, as you mentioned, sometimes the Western powers, or in this case, the US, have some other kind of pull that maybe the African Union didn't have. But that being said, from what I've been reading is that the African Union, the East African Community, and SADC, even our president here in South Africa, Ramaphosa, tried to get involved, but he was rebuffed by Kagame. You need pressure from these external actors to make these deals work. And I'm really hoping that the African Union puts a lot more pressure on the DRC and Rwanda to stay committed to this deal. It's going to be hard to keep M23 accountable because they're a non-state actor, but it's very, very important. The question that you've asked, I think it's really, really important. I'm hopeful. The signs I see from the African Union, the signs I'm seeing from the East African community, I've been seeing some stuff from President Ruto of Kenya and Museveni in Uganda. So they're quite firm on it, even Samia in Tanzania. So I'm hoping that we can, because if you think about it, in Africa, probably this conflict and Sudan's conflict are the two worst. Sudan is on another scale. That's a discussion for another day. Yeah. But I think if we can at least try and address the Eastern DRC, then we can, it's a big part of silencing the gun, part of the AU's 2063 goals. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's important.
Now, let's get to the economics of this conflict, because you are in political economy, and we actually observe that most conflicts around the world are driven by some measure of economics. Critics often say that minerals and natural resources are often fueling much of this conflict. Do you think the peace deal adequately addresses the economic dimensions, like maybe say illegal mining or cross-border trade? And beyond the economics of it, how do you see the issues of, let me say, justice and reconciliation playing out?
Yeah, no, 100%. Destiny. I think that was, I think we may have skipped over that, but in the part of the initial agreements, there's also some economic requirements. So I think there is a deal that the DRC and Rwanda set some sort of joint economic pact to work together to control mining resources with the US backing. They want to set up like some kind of central revenue system to manage, revenues from the industries. So, so on that side, and as you mentioned, the economics of it, Destiny, coming, if I'm just putting on my academic hat, there's a theory in what we call insecurity studies on how you can get peace, right? So it's called regional economic security theory, and the best example of this is the EU, right? The concept in the most simple terms, and I'm oversimplifying here, is that if two countries are deeply economically involved, they're unlikely to go to war. This is why, for example, in Europe, we haven't had a war since World War II, right? There might be tensions between the two countries, between Germany and France or the UK or whatever, but because the economies are so intertwined, it's detrimental for one country to go to war. And what I've been reading and the way I see peace talks, the way the peace talks are going, it's like they want to head in a direction where they can intertwine the DRC and Rwanda so intrinsically that it's unattractive to go to war, right? So I think that's the main driver there, and that's why also I think it's taking a long time for the actual peace deal to come out, because they're trying to work out the economic details, like who's going to be in charge of generating, controlling the revenues, all of the nitty-gritty administrative stuff. It's all good and well saying, oh, we're going to have a partnership between Rwanda and the DRC to manage mining resources, but now the technicalities of it is it's super complex. Yeah, so I think that's an important one to look at. In terms of the resources, the DRC is blessed. Rwanda also has a lot of resources, but there's enough evidence to suggest what Rwanda's output in the last year or so, according to some of the economic forecasts that we have, Rwanda's like overproducing in terms of coltan and cobalt, which is not geographically possible, because there's been surveys done that show that on the Great Rift Valley, on the DRC side, there are greater deposits of coltan and cobalt versus the Rwandan side. So you do have enough evidence to say, okay, there is the illicit trade. Look, the illicit trade in minerals is all over Africa, and I think a big part of addressing the conflict is finding a way that both countries can benefit from this, and that the citizens of Rwanda and the DRC can. So I think that's definitely an angle they're looking at, which I hope they can address. And then on your question on reconciliation, Destiny, that's a really, really tough one. We live in Africa, you're in West Africa, you see some of the conflicts around in the areas, and they leave lots of tensions behind. And as you mentioned, the key word is reconciliation. When I think about reconciliation, I think to a certain extent, Rwanda did a good job in reconciling its Hutu and Tutsi, the issues after the genocide. They had these local courts. I forget the name in Kenya, Rwanda. I forget what the name, what it is in Kenya, Rwanda, the local language. But it's a sort of local court where people can come and sit and talk and sort of open up and say, look, I committed these atrocities. It's discussed. And I think you're free from being penalized, if I'm not mistaken. It's something similar that South Africa had in 1996 post-apartheid. So I think you need to head to something like that where it's an open platform. I know it's going to be difficult. Look, I can't empathize because I haven't had someone, being killed in war, right? So I can't say I know what someone feels like. But that would be the kind of process you're going to have to get in people who specialize in sort of post reconstruction in conflict countries. And the key thing is these reconciliations, as you mentioned, talking about these problems and opening up. Because the problem is people have deep-seated tensions. There's a lot of misconceptions between, what the Tutus are and the Hutus are. But they're almost the same people. These are the differences have been propagated since the times of the colonial powers, putting these two people together. But they're almost the same people. Yeah, some cultural difference, but then they are people. So we can talk to them. So I really think this is where, and this has been the one thing I've been talking to the clients we advise, and the notes I write, is that you need to address these issues. You can come in with all kinds of economic deals, security deals, but if you don't get people to talk about the problems, and I know the DRC is such a big country and the Eastern DRC is massive, but you need to find a way to get people to talk. Otherwise, we're going to be here in 10 years' time again, Destiny, or 5 years, we'll be talking, it's conflict again in Eastern DRC, conflict again. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, amazing. Let's look at the security and the humanitarian concerns. Security still remains a key challenge in, let me say, specific regions like North Kivu or Ituri. And we have a situation where even if the M23, we know they are main players of the conflict, but even if they disarm, there are still other armed groups that will be active in the region, although not with same impact as M23.
Yes.
What are the risks of relapse into conflict, and how do you think this can be mitigated? And what about civilians? Are they seeing any changes since the deal was done?
Yeah, so again, that's again very complicated one there. So as you mentioned, Ituri, the main issue in Ituri is the ADF, as I mentioned. They are formerly a Ugandan armed group who want to sort of establish their own state in Eastern DRC, Western Uganda. So they have their issues there with both the Congolese and the Ugandan state. So that's another issue there. And then you have, as you mentioned, these these armed independent community groups. I know sometimes they go by the term Walazendo, the Swahili term for patriotic forces. So all these groups have, it's similar to what you see in Destiny in Ethiopia, where the ethnic communities have their own like community armed forces. This is why you had the conflict with the Tigrayans in Ethiopia. Again, it's also down to integrating those forces into the army and giving people sufficient protection. So the one argument that M23 have is if they are incorporated into the army, will ethnic Tutsis be protected? So now the same thing goes in other parts of Eastern DRC, Ituri, there are other culture groups there, other ethnic groups. They would be concerned if they disband their own regional forces. Even these are small forces, will their communities be protected? Again, this fits into our reconciliation. The problem with the DRC, besides all the other issues that we mentioned yesterday, the government is so focused on, just making sure Kinshasa is secure and some of its mining towns. It doesn't really address. So I've spoken to some Congolese, and one of their main issues is that service delivery is so bad in some parts of the DRC that they're only concerned with the mining towns. Getting Kinshasa right, getting the mining towns in the south right. So people are feeling neglected. So if you can address these governance issues, and as you know, you guys in Cameroon are coming up for elections, governance is important. If you get governance right, people will support you, but if you don't, it becomes a problem. And from what I see and what I've been reading, I've been checking, and I've spoken to some of our journalists, contacts on the ground, Human Rights Watch. There hasn't been a clear improvement. I did see some pieces from investigative independent journalists saying that, those that are living in the Eastern DRC feel that under M23 rule, some of them have like more stable jobs and income, but it's hard to verify. It's really complex. So on the just of my assessment, I would say no, I haven't really seen from civilians really saying that it's made much of a difference. I think we have to give it a couple of months before we can truly assess if it's been working or not. So yeah, we gotta see from there and take it from there.
Okay, thank you. Amazing. Now let's get to the last issue, which is about looking ahead. Let's look at the next, let me say, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line. And do you believe this detente could usher a new era of regional stability and cooperation in the Great Lakes? And or are we likely to see another cycle of conflict?
As I mentioned, my heart tells me I'd like it to usher in long-term stability, but my gut feel says it's going to be more of the same, where we're going to have a bit of a break and then we're going to have fighting again. I think also the way in which the court case shakes out with Joseph Kabila, the former president of the DRC, is currently on trial for war crimes and treason, which they want to push to the death penalty. Depending on how that shakes out, it's also going to have an impact because he also has ties to M23 allegedly, and he's linked to what is called the Congo River Alliance, which is another group of also with M23. They want to get rid of Tshisekedi. So my heart says I would want the DRC to have some stability in the Great Lakes. I really think Africa as a continent not just Central Africa, but Africa as a continent. If the DRC is stable and strong, we are better together. It builds part of them. I'm very much a proponent of the Pan-Africanist view. Ethnically, yeah, nationality-wise, I'm South African. I'm African. Ethnically, yes, I'm Indian of ethnicity, my ancestors in, but I believe in the Pan-African goal that Africans together can work, and we need a strong DRC. So I hope so. But Destiny, my gut says, and my analyst brain says, we're only going to have some short-term peace before it kicks off again. It's like these 2-3 years of peace and then there's conflict all over again.
Okay. Now, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind contribution and for helping us unpacking this critical issue. And we hope this PSD works, though it's fragile hope, as I would say. But I want to thank you so much for all your input, and I hope we're going to have more interesting conversations on, strategic issues concerning the Great Lakes and maybe all across the world. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure. No problem, Desmond. Thanks for having me. It was a really nice chat. I hope next time we can have maybe let's see when the peace deal comes out, maybe we can have another chat once we have the full details, and or when Kabila's trial, once it's sorted out, it'll be great to have a chat. But thanks for having me. It's a pleasure, and it's great to see another African having a great platform, or at least building your platform, because too many times we have non-Africans, not to say they're incorrect, but it's nice to have an African talking about some of our African issues. So and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you so much.